So I am going to run through the introduction and actually give the background for the large-scale fire test this time. Take it over from Mike, and then we also have Victoria Carey, as mentioned. Next slide, please. So in terms of the first notable event for New York City specifically, there has recently been released a proposed rule from FDNY on energy storage specifically. And this can be found in the proposed rules for the rules of the City of New York, or otherwise RCNY. And they are proposing adding a completely new section to Chapter 6, will be called 608-01, again, specifically tailored to outdoor stationary storage battery systems. And if you are familiar with the lithium-ion outdoor permitting guide released from CUNY and in partnership with the agencies in the city, you will notice a lot of similarities there. The rule is built upon and that guide specifically. It is currently open for public comment, so definitely take a read through, add your comments. You will have to register to the rules website, and the public hearing regarding the rule will be held at FDNY headquarters May 30th, 11 a.m. to 1:45 p.m. And in terms of timing, obviously there is a lot of lead time in terms of rules and codification, let alone implementation. So of course we will be having the processes and the current considerations in place for some time yet, but it is exciting to see and be a part of the rulemaking process as well. So definitely encourage everyone to take a read through. Feel free to write out any questions to us. We can help kind of facilitate any lack of understanding in terms of the processes outlined. With that, we have another event. Let Victoria go over.
Sure, thanks so much, Derek. So we wanted to touch on an event that some of you guys may have heard about. There was an explosion at a battery container owned by APS and installed by Fluence. And that system failure is still under investigation, but currently to date, it was understood right after the event that there were some quite serious injuries to first responders who had joined on site. I am going to hand it over to Paul Rogers, who will talk a little bit about the event and the information that's publicly available, and some of the protection measures that we're looking at in New York City to help mitigate such events and prevent them for first responders. So Paul, I'd like to hand it over to you to talk through this a little bit.
Great, thanks, Victoria. Good morning, everyone. So this incident that took place down in Arizona, in Surprise, Arizona, actually I got a call the following day from the chief of Surprise Fire Department. He was in the audience when I was doing a class, and he remembered it. He had my number, so we spoke subsequent after the event took place. Anyway, the New York City Fire Department, when I was working with them, we were fully aware of this. The initial testing that was done by Con Edison and NYSERDA through DNVGL identified there was potential of explosion. There was an explosion thing that we needed to look at. Also, UL had done some testing, so both of them together said, yeah, there's definitely some flammable cocktail in there, and you should be aware of it. So we started to look at installations when I was with FDNY with this in mind, this explosive atmosphere in mind. We were very sensitive at that particular time because we had just lost a deputy chief to an explosion with methane gas at a house fire, at a house incident. And the roof had come down on top of the deputy chief and killed him pretty much on the spot. And that was Michael Fahey, so he died in the line of duty. So we started to look at these containers specifically about how to get that gas out of there. We knew that when we showed up to the scene, if we were to see these containers sitting there, we had no idea whether there was gas in there, whether this thing may have been on fire, maybe it was on fire, maybe not as on fire. Actually, if it was on fire, we were always saying, oh, well, that's a good thing. At least it's consuming the gases. It's when it was not on fire that we were really concerned, because we knew there was this whole potential of an explosion that could take place. We also knew that the thermal imaging camera may not be effective. We've done some testing on that down in the FDNY Academy, and we realized that the thermal imaging camera was not going to be effective for that. So with that being said, we show up to this metal box. All we see is, we virtually see nothing. We're not getting any temperature readings off our thermal imaging camera. How are we going to proceed forward? Should we stay or should we go? Do we stay and hang around and wonder what's going on the inside, or do we leave there and then eventually something happens because we didn't investigate further? But how do we investigate further? It was one of the things we looked at. So we decided to come up with this emergency call number. So that emergency call number would activate a subject matter expert. Also, we were trying to get some BMS information from that, looking at the state of charge or the temperature. For those who don't know what the BMS is, that's the battery management system. We were looking to get information and data out of that. And the big one with that we're really looking for is the temperature. And when we were going around teaching our incident commanders about that, they thought it was a great idea, and they really wanted to get that information for them to make a better decision at the incident in the event that they were called there. Let's say there was a smoke signal that may have triggered a response from the fire department, or something else could have triggered the response of the fire department. Again, not knowing what's going inside the box, they wanted more information. So we wound up looking at all the installations based on the potential of explosion and non-interaction of the firefighters. And one of the things that we looked at was making sure there was monitoring and also training for the fire service. We went around explaining this to them. It's actually currently in the FDNY's curriculum now, where firefighters that go to their annual education day, which is a training day for them, they have a segment on energy storage systems, and just a very light segment. They only spend about an hour possibly going over these energy storage systems and how we need to size these things up and respond to them. And we were also concerned about, if this thing did explode, how do we get the gases out, and what should be used? So knowing this, and knowing that we wanted to try to remove those gases, we asked for a remote exhaust fan. And you can see that down in the bullet point there. That is one of the requirements for New York City, is the remote exhaust activation. And the fire department should also have an override to make sure that that thing is going on. And those procedures that were written up for these actually mention this remote exhaust. So that's going to be a requirement that the New York City Fire Department is heavily dependent on for the incident commanders to activate upon getting to the actual scene itself. Another thing that they were looking at is the 24-hour monitoring, which would be some sort of signal that would get the fire department there. And multiple alarms could be actually used in order to do that, whether it's through smoke alarm, a gas alarm, or something like that. Okay. Is that me? Oh, thanks. And as we continued to move forward, we realized, I remember going into the fire prevention, chief of fire prevention, and saying, you know, Chief, I'm concerned about, not concerned about the battery fires as much as I am concerned about what happens after the batteries go out, or the batteries that haven't gone on fire. So we started to look at decommissioning, and decommissioning is definitely a big thing now. Down in Arizona, they have not started to decommission that system yet, and they're in a standstill, and they're trying to figure it out. So they did not have a decommissioning plan set. Not sure who the vendors are that are coming in to do that. And that's still a problem in that particular area there. But in New York City, looking forward, we knew that we needed that plan for responders, because if you have these things maybe on a rooftop, right now they're only doing on rooftops and outdoors, but eventually if they get indoors, we were looking already on how do we get them out of the building safely? What's the proper way to get them out? And how do we keep a continuity of operations for the building itself? If a building needs to shut down because of this thing being unsafe, that's not good for the workers. It's not good for the companies that are in that building. So that was something that we looked at very seriously. And New York City also had put in there a requirement that they need to have someone on the scene, a subject matter expert, within a 2-hour period. So these were all things that we looked at when I was there, and they are currently still in the rule that just came out today. So you can take a look at that yourself, but I'm trying to give you the idea on how it came to be. So I guess we can go on to the next slide, and I think I'm going to hand it back to you, Victoria.
Thanks so much, Paul. And so we just wanted to go through this really, that event specifically, with Paul's additional overlay of expertise from his time in New York City, to make sure that we, one, talked about current events, but two, grounded the following conversation in the reason that we're doing this process. So at the end of the day, we're trying to get safer energy storage systems, both for day-to-day use, but also for first responders. And so coming into that, I'm going to hand it back over to Derek to talk through a recap of our process to date, and then over to Mike to talk through some of the technical aspects of that process and the desired outcome. If you're interested in learning how we're proceeding forward in more detail and getting more detailed discussion around the previous topics of explosion and toxicity topic areas, you can go back to the recordings of the prior two items. So these will just be some brief recaps, and then we'll get into the new content around thermal runaway. Derek?
Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, definitely a lot of important considerations to keep in mind. So essentially the beginning of this process within New York City began specifically regarding lithium-ion and outdoor permitting considerations with the AHJs, so namely DOB and FDNY. And through the Smart DG Hub, one of the programs that we run, we have facilitated the conversations and have gotten the right people at the table to help understand what these processes are, especially regarding 9540A. And through the DG Hub, we did release the lithium-ion outdoor permitting guide for NYC, as previously mentioned, again, as the basis for the current FDNY proposed rule. So a lot of you should be familiar, if you've read that guide, with the details of the proposed rule. And the guide is available on nysolarmap.com. And also, the proposed rule is available on, the link was a little long, so it's usually easier to just Google proposed rules in NYC, and you can see the list of different agencies' proposals, and FDNY's is going to be like the 8th in the list. So can see the actual proposed text as well. Next slide, please. So some of the kind of categories of considerations for permitting these systems were outlined within the guide, and realized really early on that there was a lot of information and data that was still needed, especially regarding how to properly design certain systems within these different categories. So cascading protections, ventilation exhaust, fire suppression siting, essentially the overview of these webinars that we're doing are captured by 9540A and will help influence and feed into how to be safe and proper depending on different siting conditions. Next slide, please. So overall, Obviously, large-scale fire testing is the kind of overall category of what 9540A is getting at. 9540A specifically is the methodology of choice that is required within NYC, and trying to figure out exactly how to supply the data, how to aggregate the data, and how to apply that data to different safety factors. So things like fire and explosion protection, kind of safety distances, but as well as kind of standard operating procedures in terms of a lot of the topics that Paul outlined for the APS event that happened. So BMS and SOP at large. Next slide, please. So overall, we have had a lot of confusion around kind of the details within 9540A, and we want to put the information together that we are having conversations with FDNY and DOB on, and release that so that everyone understands basically what this test is used for, the importance of it, and the application of it specifically, and going into the conversations with that information when beginning the permitting process. So again, through the Smart DG Hub, we've gotten FDNY and DOB together, working with their subject matter experts within their own teams, but as well as technical assistance from various SMEs, including DNV, Victoria, also Paul Rogers on our team, educational institutions, and basically getting all of the stakeholders together to move forward. And of course, that is basically our main role in aggregating and kind of coordinating this process. It should be noted that specific standards from 9540A are not being developed right now. It is a guide to understanding the application of 9540A. Next slide, please. So overall, coming from the categories of permitting that we outlined earlier, and how 9540A covers those, there were topic areas that were developed to focus on that we've been going over for the last few webinars. So we've already had toxicity and explosion. Victoria will give a brief recap of those. And we have started conversations on thermal runaway. That is where we are right now. And we've just began our first week conversation, and we will have a couple other weeks in terms of our overall 3-week cycle, which is outlined in the next slide. So basically the overall cycle for the topics is to follow 3 weeks. So kind of an intro on week 1 with what the actual topic is, background information, and essentially agreement on the pathway that the conversations will take, and the most important information that needs to be discussed. Week 2, we go into more kind of practical considerations with case studies from developers, the way that experiences have already been utilized through some of preliminary testing, but as well as people's experience with actually installing these systems in various locations and territories. And then, of course, after that meeting is held is when we are holding these webinars to basically recap what those conversations are and to give you an idea of where it's heading. And the third week being the wrap-up conclusions and trying to get the correct documentation out and consolidation and agreement among all the parties. So we do have a couple more webinars coming out, but again, we are going to run into thermal runaway on this one. Next slide, please. So there are, of course, a few things still ongoing, especially even with 9540A itself. There have been questions related to certain parts of the test and how it is utilized and move forward. UL has created flowcharts, which will be included in the next iteration of 9540A. Again, it is still a moving process, and there is still development even at a higher level end with 9540A itself, let alone how that information is utilized by the AHJs. So definitely a lot of back and forth and working together to get this to move forward. With that, I will hand it back to Victoria.
Great. Thanks so much, Derek. And I want to stay on this slide for just a second longer, Daniela, just to speak to the fact that, I think as Derek had outlined, the entire point of this process is to help define how data is utilized when it comes out of the UL 9540A test. And then how that data is utilized both for designers and as well as assessed by the authorities within the permitting applications. And so we are focusing on that data utilization with an understanding that down the road we're going to make sure that it's clear where it inserts into the permitting process in general. And I think these flowcharts are a fantastic way to visualize that. So there's a lot of discussion going on, the things that come between the lines of this flowchart, and I know that there's some updates that UL is planning for them. But this has been the basis of, at very least, the flame spread and explosion analysis that we've been discussing to date, as well as some discussion around where the data source is from and how it can be applied to various other considerations such as toxicity, thermal runaway, et cetera. So if you go to the next slide, Danielle. As I noted earlier, if you're looking for some more detailed conversation around our previous meetings, you can certainly are invited to revisit the recordings. These are not intended to be fully comprehensive recaps, but just to touch the high level and key takeaways from the two topic areas that we've closed out to date, although there are still, some remaining discussions that are ongoing. So for explosion and deflagration analysis discussions, the first area that we discussed was around data sourcing. So as was previously mentioned, and I'm sure that everyone's aware of, UL 9540A test is required for all New York City installations. This is not necessarily meaning that you have to do a test for each installation, but for each product. The test consists of 4 different levels. So the cell level test, a module level test, a unit level test, and an installation level test, which tests suppression and similar equipment. For explosion analysis, the cell level test is utilized, the data from the cell level test is utilized to ascertain the composition and characteristics of off-gassing from abnormal events with batteries. The unit level test, or in some cases the module level test, depending on how the propagation proceeds within a module, that test is utilized to determine the volume and flow rate of the gases that is used in explosion analysis. We've gotten a lot of questions around what is a quote-unquote approved test lab to provide this data. To date, there's consideration for test data coming from nationally recognized testing labs that have UL 1973 certification. So they have the authority to test and certify to UL 1973. There is ongoing discussion around this, but right now that is the baseline that we're starting from and has been discussed with both FDNY and DOB as acceptable at this juncture. As I note, these are ongoing discussions, but that's what we have to date. The final item around data sources, and another question that's come up quite frequently, is around variability in system design. It's understood that at the current moment, the storage industry utilizes a lot of customized design, especially for large-scale systems. And the conclusion was that you may be able to test the quote-unquote worst-case scenario design and then utilize that data for other installations that are not identical, but that have sufficient parallels. That assessment needs to be a quantitative assessment conducted by the laboratory who's conducting the UL 9540A test. that the assumptions and methodology that's utilized need to be documented and submitted along with the conclusion of what is the worst case scenario test. Around assumptions and calculations, I've just noted a few of them here. One of them is how do you determine what the container volume is? So in our discussions, it was ascertained that the volume that you use for any of your calculations is the total volume of the container minus obstructions. So obstructions may be the racks and modules. It's not necessary to get to the level of granularity that you're accounting for potentially small amounts of dead space between cells within a module. You can consider the rack to be, a single unit when you're considering container volume. We also discussed what values can be tested for versus calculated. When determining the effectiveness of ventilation, that is a calculated value. It's understood that in testing conditions, there's a large amount of gases and smoke are being pulled out of the area for the safety of the laboratory that's conducting the lab, as well as to enable rigorous sampling of that off-gassing. So the ventilation impact for an on-site installation would be determined through calculation rather than demonstrated through testing. However, for determination of LFL, the lower flammability limit of the cocktail of gases coming off of a engaged cell or unit, that is done through testing, and the test methodology that's recommended is outlined in UL 9540A. There are some discussions around how it's determined that how a design is determined to be acceptable. It is recommended that first the system you strive to bring the LFL as low as possible. Currently in the flowchart, there was a recommendation to bring it down to 25% LFL, which is in line with current codes and standards. However, regardless of the effectiveness of ventilation, even if it brings it below 25% LFL, further analysis is still required. It is required that partial volume deflagration calculations are conducted for all sites, all systems, to determine the threat of a partial volume deflagration and therefore the appropriate mitigation strategies and venting. Finally, we touched on threat mitigation for explosion discussions. There is more conversation underway here, but it was determined for acceptable design strategies. NFPA is cited as standard practice. However, there's an openness to alternative methods with validation and assumptions included. In generic design, upward deflagration will be required. There may be allowances to not pursue upward deflagration, but that would be on a case-by-case basis and is not expected to be the standard operating procedure. So it is recommended that all systems be submitted with upward deflagration planned. The ongoing conversation, as I mentioned, is around what thresholds are considered to be acceptable and reasonably mitigated, bringing the system into an acceptably safe threshold for bystanders and first responders. But just for a generic level of understanding, you do need to consider threats from fireballs, pressure waves, and projectiles coming off of the unit. You can go to the next slide, Danielle. Now for a quick recap on toxicity, much less text on this slide. The considerations for toxicity are more limited based on understanding to date of the comparative differences between energy storage system fires and other types of fires, finding the toxicity levels to be quite similar, or the toxicity types to be of gases to be quite similar. So the first note is that for the first responder impact, additional calculations are not necessarily required, that it's expected that first responders will utilize personal protective equipment, or PPE, and other defensive approach tactics to ensure that they're not unnecessarily exposing themselves to toxic gases. For bystanders, There's a current discussion around the secondary means of egress from a space, and this is dependent on the facility type and other requirements per code, building code. Similarly, exhaust locations for off gases will be as identified in code if appropriate. So for exhaust from indoor installations, and ensuring that egress pathways are never impacted by such exhausts. Although data from UL 9540A is going to be collected, and you can identify the speciation of gases in the that are issuing from a cell that's undergoing thermal runaway or other abnormal conditions, that data is not expected to be further analyzed. That the baseline will be a potential cross-reference between the off-gas data compositions and flow rates found from UL 9540A testing in comparison to the off-gassing from other fires, essentially using the baseline to say whether or not the fire toxicity is similar to that of other fires and therefore does not need to be treated with any additional or special consideration. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. So the next few slides are going to be overviewing the thermal runaway topic area, the discussions that we've had to date. Thermal runaway, just to get everybody on the same page, is defined both in the NFPA 855 current draft as well as UL 9540A as a condition when an electrochemical cell increases its temperature through self-heating. And it's critical here that this is happening in an uncontrollable fashion, and that thermal runaway is occurring when that cell's heat generation is created at a higher rate than can be dissipated. So the critical part is that it is uncontrollable and that the heat cannot be dissipated. So if you go to the next slide. Thank you. So essentially, thermal runaway proceeds through a few different steps, and that system failure can be both identified and mitigated at a certain level. So you see here in the text, we're noting essentially there's an initiating abuse event. There is some abnormal off-gassing where a cell may burst and off-gas to release pressure. Then the next step is thermal runaway in that cell, and then there's the potential for cascading runaway. So we want to make sure that we differentiate between these different steps in the thermal runaway process, so that it's understood at what points can it be mitigated and at what level. So we've included here just some quick diagrams, and these are just short references. But the first one is identified from Nexaris, providing a nice graphic showing where off-gas is detected with this blue vertical line, and then the green vertical line demonstrating where smoke is detected. And so there's this gap between when off-gassing occurs. You can see in red the cell is heating up, off-gassing occurs, and then thermal runaway is initiated where there's a spike in temperature at that point. And then although in this the cell temperature is falling, as a single cell, if it's surrounded by other cells, that could cascade potentially in a module. The second diagram that we have here is just to demonstrate that there are potential mitigation measures. This diagram is showing the delay caused by some insulation between cells. So where the Nexaris mitigation measure is differentiating between abnormal off-gassing and cell thermal runaway. The UT Austin data that we're showing here is differentiating between cell thermal runaway and cascading runaway, so that you can have some mitigative effect, slowing down the thermal runaway, potentially allowing for other mitigation measures to come into play. The third item that we have here is just sourced from DNVGL. This is testing data that determined the impact of the state of charge on the eventual consequence level from a burning cell. So you can see on the left-hand axis that this is talking about percent weight loss. And so the idea is if you're losing a lot of cell mass as it's burning, that more is being transitioned into gases that could be flammable, explosive, or toxic. And as the SOC, the state of charge, increases, that on average, the loss of mass increases. So we're just showing this here as something that can be managed as far as BMS controls are concerned or battery management systems are concerned to minimize the impact from a failure event. So understanding where your state of charge is at all times can directly impact the results of a fire condition. And these are just being shown as examples of the differentiation between various steps and stages in a system failure. You can go to the next slide, Danielle. So we wanted to make sure that we identified what the AHJ concerns are around thermal runaway. So we identified 5 major concerns. So first, that there are untested claims of resistance to thermal runaway. And if you click to the next slide, Daniela, we expect this to be addressed through the requirement for UL 9540A testing. The next item is the concern around undetected failure. And if you click to the next slide, the expectation is that this is addressed through both BMS controls and system monitoring that are just required prescriptively as opposed to based on results from UL 9540A testing. You can go to the next slide. The next 3 items are around the impact from thermal runaway. So within this current topic area, we are focusing on just this initiating event of thermal runaway rather than the longer term impacts from it. So we're separating essentially the threat from the consequences. And so these following 3 items around the release of explosive and toxic gases or the development of fire conditions are being addressed under other topic areas. In fact, we just talked about how the management of explosive gases is handled as well as toxic gases. And we'll be talking a little bit later about fire conditions in our 3-week cycles. You can go to the next slide. So the sort of key takeaway here, and when we're talking about analysis requirements, and just remembering that we're coming back to UL 9540A data analysis requirements for this particular effort, it is expected that first responders are going to be on site after thermal runaway occurs and a larger consequence has been initiated. So either an explosion or a fire and the release of those gases, creating that potential. And so to that end, the current understanding is that thermal runaway is managed from a testing perspective rather than additional analysis. The UL 9540A test will run a cell and a module and a system through its paces to ascertain if thermal runaway occurs. And then for the other topic areas, that will characterize the impact of thermal runaway. So we're not in this topic area managing anything other than does thermal runaway occur or not. In addition to this, one of the concerns, and it's something that's come up quite a lot, is does my system have to do UL 9540A testing? We don't go into thermal runaway. Well, it's required that you go through the testing regardless, and although mitigative measures are appreciated and can and should be tested, just because there are mitigative measures in place does not indicate that testing is not required, and documentation and verification of the quality of such mitigative measures can, however, serve as useful data points for a risk analysis and a quantitative analysis of the quality of such a mitigation measure. So you can go to the next slide, Danielle. So just to wrap up, as I mentioned a few different times, there are open items. This is an iterative process, and we are working constantly with different subject matter experts and gathering more information as requested to support the decision making and documentation of already made decisions of FDNY and DOB. Specifically, the critical items for explosion are how threat is defined or how an acceptable level of risk is defined, both for first responders and bystanders. For toxicity, we're working on a benchmark for treating the off gases like any other fire condition and how that benchmark can be determined. The next item that we're going to be working on next week is fire spread. So we're going to be starting on that topic area next Wednesday and proceeding forward as Derek described in our 3-week schedule. And we welcome the suggestion or support of case studies from any who are on the call. If there's any data or reference material that you have on fire spread and battery fire spread, suppression systems, etc., we certainly welcome that, and we would look forward to hearing from you through the DG Hub email address. So if you go to the next slide, Danielle, you can just show them the contact information. Great. Thank you. So if you have any case studies or you think that you might have something to contribute to the fire spread discussion, again, as I noted, around either battery, fire spread, mitigation measures, including suppression of water, suppression by clean agent or similar, ventilation, or physical barriers such as fire-resistant construction, we certainly welcome any information, and you can send it over to Smart DG Hub, and we'll set up a meeting to discuss your information and data and how it can be applied. With that, I want to open it up to questions from anyone on the call.
Okay, well, this is Ron Reisman. We have a couple of questions that have been written in through the box, and we would encourage people to ask their questions that way, rather than opening up the phone line. So let's go through these questions, and as we do that, other participants who have something to ask can write theirs in. But the first question is whether we need to have certification for UL 1973.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Well, I don't know who the we is in this instance, but that's the way the question was phrased. Okay. Do we need to have certification for UL 1973?
I guess let me answer it in both. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. This I know we've spoken with the asker before, and it's most likely in regards to flow batteries.
Okay. Then
I believe the question is sort of generally for battery systems. If it's sort of looked at from that way, then I wanted to make sure everybody in the audience is aware that UL 1973 is required for all battery chemistry types.
Okay, and if the questioner would like to, sort of elaborate or clarify on that, they can write the answer in, and we'll get back to that one later. Two questions that came in that are pretty much identical. One asks if there is a list of NERTLs. Love that word, NERTLs, certified to perform UL 1973, and the other similarly asks, how can we find out who are the approved test labs that are UL 1973 certified?
This is Victoria. So nationally recognized testing laboratories can be looked up online by simply searching for them. At this juncture, there is some individual effort required to ascertain if they're certified, and the testing laboratories will know and will be able to provide that information. CUNY is in the process of collecting a list of laboratories who are pursuing the capabilities to perform UL 9540A testing, but to date, the best guidance that we can provide is what has been provided by FDNY and DOB to date, which is that if it is a nationally recognized testing laboratory that's certified to UL 1973, that the testing data will be accepted.
Okay. Since you brought up 9540A, this sort of leads us into another question here that asks whether UL 9540A is required for both New York City and New York State, and for both indoor and outdoor systems at the present time, or is this a future requirement?
It is required for New York City for all installations, regardless of indoor or outdoor. For New York State, I believe it's a broader requirement. So in the case that there's a desire to install outside of prescriptive requirements, that UL 9540A in that case would need to be pursued.
Okay. One of our participants asks a question about thermal runaway and wants to know if there's been a determination as to what constitutes resistance to thermal runaway.
So there's not any special allowances that are provided for systems that are resistant to thermal runaway. The requirement is to go through UL 9540A testing and determine if it occurs, and if it does occur, then to measure the output gases and resultant effects of it. The resistance to thermal runaway right now is just a useful piece of information, and also I would say a useful mitigative tool to ensure the improved safety of your system. However, if it proceeds into thermal runaway, regardless of the duration or methodology by which that occurs, the full analysis is still required for explosion, toxicity, fire spread, etc.
Okay, we'll give Victoria a little rest here and address the next question to Derek. This has to do with definitions of some of the words that came up during the presentation. And a participant wants to know if you can define the meaning of a rule in New York City and the authority that a rule holds. There's a sort of a follow-up question here as to how do rules compare or interact with, for example, building and fire codes. So how does a rule differ from something that's a code?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So RCNY, the rules of the City of New York, are actually the rules and regulations that the NYC city government agencies are following. And within the rules, under, different sections for fire department and building department, but within those sections are codified the building code and the fire code. So it is interesting because also the building code and the fire code are kind of listed and hosted separately as well, but they're also incorporated into these RCNY codes, but they reflect each other. So when FDNY wants to add a section to Chapter 6 in RCNY, that would also be adding it to the fire code as well. So it's basically literally in addition to the fire code.
Yeah, this is Paul Rogers. I'm just going to add into that, if that's all right, Derek. The way explained to me is a rule similar to what Derek had said is similar to like an executive order by a agency within the New York City. So in this case, FDNY saying, hey, you need to fulfill this executive order or rule in order to get any type of approval.
Yep.
Okay, hope that clarifies the issue. A housekeeping question here for Daniela. Someone wants to know how they can get a copy of the presentation. Is that going to be posted somewhere or circulated, or will there be a link going out to participants?
Actually, yeah, the recording of this entire webinar will be posted on our storage page, soft cost reduction page, which is the link that's shown right on the screen. That also has, by the way, just also for the audience, that also has the recordings of the last two webinars. So all, eventually by the end, all 5 of the webinar recordings will be up there.
Excellent. Well, that finishes up the list of questions that have been sent in to us. So with just a few minutes left in this webinar anyway, I'll turn it back over to Daniela for a wrap-up.
Yeah, well, thank you everybody for joining again. We hope you will join us next time in 3 weeks from now. The topic will be on fire spread. And of course, we, as new updates happen. We will be including those too. So there might be some new news by then. Looks like we'll be able to wrap up a few minutes early, but if people have additional questions that come up afterwards, you can certainly feel free to reach out to us at any time with those. And we're an open resource for general questions. If you're exploring projects and you're looking for some technical assistance on the permitting process, we're open to assisting anyone who is in need. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the